Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the second in the series of left and right thinking. What do they know? Do they know things? Let's find out. Now, this series I will be continuing in this format from now on. I will be covering a ideology and the philosopher that's behind it. If there's more than one, I will go over both of them, maybe in separate videos. But I will basically, be spending, each video will be on a certain ideology. So today we've got a big one, and that is Marxism and Communism. And of course, we'll be focusing on Karl Marx, and we will also be going behind the lives of that philosopher. So in this case, we'll be going behind the case of Karl Marx, and we will also be putting pros and cons of what that ideology is trying to represent, or what ideas the philosopher is trying to put forward. So I will try my very best to be unbiased. If you have, put a comment. Maybe you want to put a suggestion for who I should do next. Otherwise, I'll just be going through, random people on my top of my head. So without further ado, let's get on with the show.
Live from the historic Studio 60 on the Sunset Strip, J.D. Salinger presents Hollywood stars and celebrities. What do they know? Do they know things? Let's find out.
Welcome, Mr. Marx, to the show. It's lovely having you on here, and you are our first ever guest. So you have the honour of setting the stage for future philosophers. Now, I know you won't be doing much of the talking, and I will be explaining your philosophy, but you have told me in confidence earlier what your views are, and I hope I try my best to represent what you have told me. So, without further ado, let's get on with your history. Now, Karl Marx was around during the Industrial Revolution, and at the time, it was when basically people were really, the world was really starting to change. A lot of ideas were coming out, lots of things were created. It was like the railway lines, coal, steam engines, things like that. It was all starting to think the New World in America, that was starting to, people were starting to build there. But the main things at the time were socialism. And really, they came from early Britain and France. And, as I mentioned before, the French Revolution was, socialism was sort of like a utopian idea. And I think that's a good way of describing it. So it is a utopian idea. And it was around during the French Revolution. And you had ideas like liberty, equality, and fraternity. And, I think we'd all, or most of us would like that sort of thing, liberty, equality. But yeah, that was what was basically going on at the time. There were lots of wars as well, and lots of recessions and depressions as a result of society. The big changes. So people were losing faith, and things were starting to change as well with money as well. Because before the Industrial Revolution, it was a lot of there was money, but there was taxes, things like that. But there were still some things like trade. It would be more like I'll give you 6 chickens for 1 duck or something like that. Money was around, but you'd have that going on. I mean, that was more something to do with the medieval periods, trade like that. But it was, a lot more money centric. Now, where the communists come into all this was basically it started as a workers' movement in the 1830s in Germany, and it was a growing party. And eventually, they got in contact with Karl Marx, and he was with them for a little bit, but he didn't get on too well with them. But it came to the conclusion that he was going to write this big little book that would be propaganda promoting communism, because he believes, and he says in Marxism as well, that he thinks the proletariat really are the only people that can pay for this utopian idea, and they can only do that through revolution against the bourgeoisie. So yeah, he ended up writing it. It was very late, and he fell out of all the people that he was writing this book, but he did end up finishing it. Very short, but it was meant to be so the proletariat could quickly read it, understand, and start the revolution. Now, these revolutions didn't end very well, and they only lasted a couple of days, and as a result, Karl Marx fled to England and spent the rest of his life there. And a lot of people will argue as well and say, he didn't work much as well because he lived with his wife, but I'll go on with that maybe later. But yeah, so that was basically the life of Karl Marx. He did write other things as well, but he's most known for the Communist Manifesto. I think the best quote for this, though, that Karl Marx made was as follows. In times when the class struggle nears the decisive hour, the process of dissolution going on within the ruling class, in fact within the whole range of old society, assumes such a violence, glaring character, that a small section of the ruling class cuts itself adrift and joins the revolutionary class. That's the proletariat. The class that holds the future in its hands. Just as, therefore, at an earlier period, a section of nobility went over to the bourgeoisie, so now a portion of the bourgeoisie goes over to the proletariat. And in particular, a proportion of the bourgeoisie, ideologists, who have raised themselves to a level of comprehending theoretically the history movement as a whole. So what he's saying is these are sort of like philosopher kings, or people like him and Eagles, who was someone he worked with, were the people that came over to the proletariat, and they were the best to understand it and sort of run it, and could explain it to the proletariat and help them revolutionise when these recessions happened. But as we know, that didn't work, and it failed for at least Karl Marx. However, there are others. Russia and China are both well known for having history with communism. You had Mao's China, and you had Stalin's Russia. So I might go on about them at the end, but yeah, so he did have, they were people that took his ideas and used them for their own. But yeah, that's essentially the legacy he has left behind. Okay, so now that I've gone over the history of Karl Marx, what I'm going to do now is break down into points, pros and cons of Marxism and communism, and using arguments that Marx put throughout the book and that I picked out, and there's probably more. I may have missed some, so pick up your own Communist Manifesto. It's only about 60 or 40-ish pages. It's not that big, so if you really want to read it, it's not that much. So without further ado, I'll start. So the first argument that Karl Marx puts forward is that at the time society was broken, and the patriarchy and the family unit had sort of lost its value. It wasn't so much a social thing anymore. What was more important was your cash, what sort of cash value you had as a person. So if you haven't got a lot of cash, you're not a thing in society. And what he means by that is, at the end of the medieval period, and I know he was really around in the industrial period, but he's put towards this argument. He says, at the end of it, it was the end of feudalism. And what that basically was a hierarchy. So you had at the very top the kings, queens, and then below that you'd have the nobles and the bishops. Below that you'd have knights, and then at the very bottom you'd have serfs and serfs and peasants. So what happened in that sort of society was serfs, if you don't know, they basically had less rights than a peasant, really. But no matter how bad things got for them, and it would normally happen during times of war, but if a serf, had nothing, they had no money, they had no food, rather than starve to death, they could go to one of these nobles, or to a king or a queen or a knight or something like that, anyone who had power basically, and they could say to them, look, I need I need food, I need a place to live, and they can grant that, and they'd grant it to them, and it'd be at a cost. They would sort of lose their freedom. So yes, they would have food and housing, but they'd lose their freedom. But they weren't slaves, so they would still get paid. And what Marx is basically saying is that no matter how bad things got, they could always pay for their freedom. So it wasn't, cash, okay, it was still important, but, you could sort of buy yourself out of that situation and, save up, get your own thing, maybe become a noble yourself. Highly unlikely, but it could still happen. And that's what Marx is basically saying in this point. Marx then goes on to criticise capitalism. He puts it like this. Capital is a collective product, and only by the united action of many members, nay, in the last resort, only by the united action of all members of society, can it be set in motion. Capital is therefore not personal, it is a social power. When, therefore, capital is converted into common property, into the property of all members of society, personal property is not thereby transformed into social property. It is only the social character of the property that is changed. It loses its class character. Let us now take wage labour. The average price of wage labour is the minimum wage. i.e. the quantum of the means of the substance which is absolutely requisite to keep the labourer in bare existence as a labourer. What Karl Marx means by this is that essentially the labourer, or the proletariat, are at the hands of mercy to the bourgeois, the owners of the company. So they will give them the bare minimum to go along and carry out what they need to do to live, but they're sort of essentially trapped in there. And so all the bourgeois is profiting and doing well out of their business. The poor proletariat is basically, trapped. He can't get out of this, but he needs to work in order to have money to live. Of course, it isn't as black and white as Marx has put it. So let's give a counter-argument from a capitalist perspective. What they would argue is that it's essentially supply and demand when it comes to jobs. If there's a demand for a certain service, people are more likely to pay more for that service as it's needed. For instance, in the UK, at a time, and we're still in this situation, we need a lot of nurses in the NHS. And what we were doing is, normally you have to pay for your university costs and take out a loan. But for a little bit, what we started doing was paying for people's education. So if you wanted to become a nurse, basically you got a bursary, so that would pay for the entire course as long as you completed it and spend a set amount of time in the NHS working as a nurse or doctor or whatever. So that was a good example of supply and demand there, because you can see that we needed something, so the bourgeois, I know it's the government, but they've essentially paid for this because they need that service. But to be fair to Karl Marx, we're going to use it in his current time period. So he's saying that factory workers, they didn't actually earn that much. They really were on the beans, nothing really. So when he's saying they're trapped, they were trapped, and situations like that were at the time dire. There's a great book called Inspector Calls, where it's a play about how this rich family basically are responsible, that they all interact with this one girl that works at this company, and it's basically an argument for the labour movement, and what they called it's basically an argument for the labour movement. And of course, they just take advantage of this poor girl. She ends up dead, and they get this inspector who comes in, who's called Inspector Ghoul, and spoilers, I'll ruin the ending. So he's actually a ghost, but he's just meant to be on their conscience. And it's just before World War One took place, but it's sort of like the Victorian era, the end of that sort of era. The Titanic's just sunk. It's sort of the end of that time where you could basically treat your workers like crap. So once the unions started forming, and I'll probably do another video on unions, but once the unions started forming, they were starting like, well, you know what, we need this, we want that, and they'd strike, and if you need these needs, which that's what Karl Marx actually say this. He says, and it does happen when you have recessions. He goes on about how during the recessions that the proletariat basically fight up, and it happened over like certain amount of years. I've written it. I will mention it. I've already mentioned the years, but when these recessions happened, they'd fight up, they'd wreck the society, and then it had to rebuild itself, and constant. And this would happen during his time. It happened loads. There were many wars going on during this period, but every time these fights were happening, they were getting more rights. It's like I said, once it got to the end of World War One, just before that point, rights really started to improve. Penicillin's also responsible for that, and that prevented a lot of deaths. But a lot of rights started coming in. Women started getting, the vote, equal pay in the 1960s and 70s. Some of these battles are still going on today, but essentially we're now at a point where, being a factory worker now is actually a good thing. You get paid quite a lot. You've got the machines doing it for you. But like I said, Karl Marx at the time, he's got a point. They weren't well off, but it did work out in the end. So I don't think it's fair to have a go at Marx with his views, at least for the argument of trying to look out for the poor and the proletariat. But I don't think it's at the same time it's relevant to use these points today. However, like I said, that's my opinion. You're welcome to. Like I said, I'm just giving you the arguments pro and for. And if you, maybe leave a comment if you disagree with me. I'd love to, because I think it's always fair to get a different perspective. So, yeah. So let's move on from this point. Now, a second point that Marx put, well, the last one was quite long, was that nations are now depending on others for needs, in certain sectors and areas, which, actually it seems quite funny, because that's sort of an argument with the European Union today. It's sort of like it wants to become a super state in a way, and you can have your opinions on that, but I thought that was quite interesting. This argument, it's still, it was a thing back then, it's still a thing today, that what's more important, nationalism or basically being like a united world. It's sort of that argument. But what Marx states was that nations, because they were now dependent in certain areas. So let's say country A produces all the food, and then country B produces, I don't know, clothing or things like that. And so, there'd be trade going on, and because you've got cash now, it's a bit more like, I'll pay you, this and this and that. And what he was saying was that, it's sort of like, that's a real dangerous thing in a way, because let's say you have a war with country A and country B have a war. Well, country B now has no food. They're going to starve to death. I think country A will probably end up winning that war, unless it's over within 3 days. But what he was saying is, basically, nations were no longer depending on themselves. They had to be dependent on others, and he didn't like that. And he was also saying as well that the East was dependent on the West to survive. So really the East were more proletariat, but you would have proletariat within all the nations, but the East was more of a poorer area, and the West took advantage of that, and they were really dependent on the West to survive as a country and as a nation. Marx didn't like that at all. Now you could argue that if we use that in today's society, that's not really going to happen. Just because or even if we use it in Marx's time, let's say country A has a problem with country B. Okay, country B can now go to country C for food. So although they're dependent on other nations, there's always more than one option. And if we use it in today's society, I don't think we have any big Western nations that are starving. Anyone in the Western nations are really starving. Maybe a few, but it's very, very tiny and minute. So that would be an argument to counter that point there. Another point that Karl Marx made as well was that really, because of the way society was now set up, you'd end up having depressions and financial crashes like we have today in the stock market. And this happened quite a lot while he was around. You had one in 1825, you had one in 1836, you had one in 1847, and these are just 3 dates that I found of when things were really bad up. And so because of this, more likely to have a catastrophe or a crash, or people are going to lose faith. Lots of things happen, like famine can happen, and famine is now not just going to affect that one nation, because the other nation is dependent on that nation. That nation is also going to starve. And see what I mean? That there's a lot of it's sort of like a protection net. He really liked the protection net, and you've lost that. And again, you could counter that with, you got a different country, but I think Karl Marx was kind of oh god, I don't really like that. And I can see where he's coming from, because he was saying the society wasn't stable either. These depressions keep happening. So even if it wasn't food, there'd be basically times where things would end up dire. And as a result of that, the poor would just, they'd rise up against their masters, like the French Revolution, and they'd rise up and, destroy that society and rebuild itself. But then, before 20 years, it gets corrupt again. There's another war, crashes, works out. It just was a constant, war, or, problem after problem after problem. It wasn't stable. At least before, it was more likely stable. There were still wars and things, but what Karl Marx is saying is that it's no longer stable in that current situation. Another argument they can make on the supply and demand thing is that although Karl Marx does put it as essentially the proletariat are trapped, let's say we put, one of these proletariat in a certain trade. So let's say a plumber. So let's say he's an apprentice plumber and he's working with David. Now, ignore how much plumbers get paid today. Let's just say they don't, they get paid alright. But so he's got no skills, but he starts working with his training. And before you know it, David has now got some skills. And what he can do now is David can either go up to his boss and say, well, I can do this now and such, and this does happen in a collaborative society, is he can say, well, what, I work this hard, I'd like a raise. Now, of course, his boss doesn't have to say no, and let's say that like Karl Marx is, let's put Karl Marx theory, so, they're not going to give him a wage because they want to make as much profit as possible, and it happens in real life, Let's say they can't afford it if they did, but let's just use Karl Marx's example that, they don't want to pay at all, so he doesn't want to pay for him. So now David has two choices. He can either A, shut up and keep working for that company, or 2, he could make his own plumbing business. So he takes what funds he's got, and using those funds, he can create his own plumbing business. I mean, he could take out a loan, he could take out, he could take out a loan, or he could do saving, because if we look at it from a modern society's perspective, you're never sort of trapped in a job unless you're a slave, but that's not really a problem too much in the West. It does go on, but at Karl Marx's time, I think he makes more of a fair point. But if we use it in today's modern society, David's not going to be trapped. Okay, he's probably getting paid quite well for a plumber. Let's say he's not getting paid too well. He's on apprentice wage. It's like £3.70 in the UK. Anyway, he's got his. So now he's decided, you know what, I'm going to start my own business. So he starts his own plumbing business. Now let's say his boss, I don't know, charges for a job £1,000. It's completely wrong rates, but let's just say he charges £1,000 for a job, right? Now David could do this. He could say, you know what, I'm going to charge £800. Now the customer, the person, who's, would go, well, do I pay for £1,000 or do I pay around 800? Now, okay, they might go by skill and thing, but let's say they're a bit cheap. No, I'm going to pay for David. So David has now taken the business off his boss and has just gained £800 for doing his own work. And what David has also done is he's taken a risk, because at the same time, they could also say, you know what, no, I want to go professional. And David could strike out. He could become poor. He could fail his business. But that's the risk in Marx's term, the bourgeois take. And I think that's what Marx fails to comprehend, is when it comes to businesses, you have to make these choices. Do you, A, work for an employer, and, worst case scenario, you lose your job, but you don't go into a load of debt. You might have to take out loans and things, but there's a lot less risk if you're employed by someone. Whereas if you're an employer, there's lots of things that go wrong. You get sued, you have to pay for insurance so you don't get sued, and safety and regulations, you have to provide some amount of holidays. It's not as easy as a job. There's more money in it, being the employer, so there are more benefits there, but there's also more risk as well. So essentially it comes down to, are you willing to take more risk? And that's what the capitalists would argue in this situation. Okay, so now that we've gone over the pros of communism, I'm going to now counter them with cons that people will come up as common arguments against it. Like before, I will counter these cons with pros from communists and maybe recounter that back. We'll just see how it goes. So my first argument I wanted to state was this one. Now this is a quote from Karl Marx himself. He says, "Communism may be summed up in a single sentence: abolition of private property." Now what he means by this is in a communist society, basically the state owns everything. So there's no private businesses, it's all state run. So instead of McDonald's, you just have the McDonald's or the restaurant. So it's Burger King, McDonald's, KFC, everything all combined if you were using fast food, for example. So if we took our plumber from earlier, the proletariat guy, let's say David, and though David just said in the story it was boss, but I think you guys understood what I was saying. So we've got David, the plumber, and let's say he took the second option where he decided to run his own business, and he did well, and he's actually, built up his own empire and things. And then he's got a pupil below him, Brad, or maybe someone who's the same age as him, but Brad hasn't really bothered, he hasn't really tried, but he's now a plumber with him. Now in a communist society, Brad and David are at the same level. It's no longer David's business, it's the state. So they all get the same pay, they get the same things. So even though Daniel has worked really hard to have this, communists would take that away from him. They wouldn't want him to have his own business. So if communism ever took over, anyone who's earned businesses, it would just be gone. It just belongs to the state now, it's just mine. Brad, even though Brad hasn't earned that, he's now taken that. Now to be fair to Karl Marx, like I said, the society's a lot better off today. Things, aren't quite as black and white as that, or there's a lot more less chance of this happening. But you do have Marxists today who will, say that's fine, but let's put it in this situation. If that was your business, if you worked hard, think of something you'd really want to do and you've earned it, okay, or think of like a dream, or if you had to open a place, like think of a place you'd like to open. Okay, now picture that you've done really well with that dream, you've opened your own businesses. Would you really like someone to take that from you? And that's one of the arguments they'll take. Now Marxists will argue back and say, yes, but everyone's equal, we've got the same pay. And that's that's a nice thought. Everyone gets the same pay. You don't have to try as hard either, though. But is that a good thing? Would you want people would you if you got a GCSEs, let's go say that's an exam in the UK for those American viewers or people who are outside UK. Let's say you did really hard in your exams, right? You revised, you get the best possible grade, but someone else in your class doesn't revise and they get like a lower grade than you. But in a communist society, it doesn't matter. You both, let's say you need you'd still end up with the same job with the same prospects. Basically, it doesn't matter how good or bad you are. And okay, although things may be equal, it doesn't reward effort, and that would be an argument they'd put forward. This argument made by Karl Marx I actually really liked. He put in, basically, because of the time of the industrial period, it basically forced nations across the world to adapt to the bourgeois' way of thinking and principles in order for them to compete. So what he meant was, let's say you take a nation that would hand knit everything, or to craft clothing and things like that. Well, now you've got machines that do it for that, so you can produce more clothing. You don't need as many workers. You can lay some of these workers off as well. I don't care. I'm a bourgeois guy. I don't give a damn. So I'm laying off these workers. I can pay them less. But let's say a nation doesn't want to do that. Okay, they're welcome to do that. But now they can't compete because the machines are going to be far better and far quicker, producing more clothing and probably more quality than if it's hand stitched. That's probably not true if hand stitching, but you know what I mean. There's more demand. So, if country B wants X amount of sweaters, so 2,000 sweaters, probably the machine is going to beat the man when it comes to who's going to make the most amount of sweaters. So they're going to go to that country, for the sweaters. Now, an argument against this would be that you don't have to adapt to these needs, because as a nation you can choose whether you want to be part of the bourgeois. You could, if you have your own nation, let's say if your own little state or own little country, I could be. Gandhi was quite pro for this. What I found out was quite interesting. He actually quite liked some of the original ways that the Indians did certain things. So again, how they stitch clothing and things like that. And you can look this up. But he basically was quite. He wanted to keep the traditions of India, and India were quite happy to do that. I mean, there's a big population problem, but take that aside. Let's say you haven't got Indians' population problem, and what he was saying was, you don't have to do that. You can just, he could just cut himself off. Like North Korea. Okay, North Korea is not a good example, but what he was saying is you don't have to be part of the bourgeois. You can grow your own food. You can grow your own factories for everything you need. Your own factory, things like that. You can be self-reliant. You don't have to rely on other countries. Another argument on this as well, and I think this is quite a cool one, or an easy one to understand at least, is let's say you want to make a tractor. Now, in a communist society, you'd have the tractor, the one tractor. Okay. Now, in a capitalist society, you could have the tractor, the trackie, different types of tractors. Okay, but at the end of the day, you're going to go based off which one's the best. Now, you could argue in the communist society that you've made the very best tractor, and in capitalist it could be like, well, one's good, one's faster, one can get more grain. So I don't know much about tractors, but they could say that the tractor is the best one. But you started this competition, so now company 1 and company B are both making tractors. Only one of them's going to survive. They might be like, well, let's make our one fast and also make it more, make it faster and be a bit good at making grain. And come B will get that, and they have a fight, and and it will be a clash, and eventually you'll get a better tractor. So though you've got the tractor, and it could be the best tractor at the time, then it's just the tractor. That's it. It's left like that. It's stuck in that position. There's no one competing for it. So why make the tractor any better? There's no need for it. Whereas the other place, the capitalist society have now got, tractors that keep competing to get better tractors and better and better and better and better. Now you've got a better tractor than the communist tractor. And, that's a very simple argument to counter the point about, how bad competition is in this situation, or like you're forced to have the bourgeois. At the end of the day, the consumer's going to profit the best out of this. It's not actually going to be the person who's producing it. The consumer is, because they might charge less for the tractor as well. They might be like, oh, well, I need to compete with my competitors, although mine's better. People aren't going to pay as much. So, you have this. There's a lot more options out there. You don't have to go for just one tractor. Well, thank you, Mr. Marx. I think we've learned a lot today. I hope I've covered everything thoroughly. I know we could have spent hours on this topic. It's a very big one, and it's often one with huge conflicts, either for or against. However, I hope I've represented your views as well as I could. But what I'd like to finish on is this point, and I think that the main issue people have with your ideology is that it's the seizing of property. Now, what you really want and represent is you think that by seizing property, it's sort of like a far left ideology. The left is normally giving the state more power. They basically want the state to look after people. And communism is at the far extreme. So at this point, the government own all facilities, all production lines, and all housing, healthcare, things like that. So the government are basically in charge, and everyone's at an equal level. So there's no managers and things like that. The issue I think people take with this is the fact that it sort of promotes maybe a lazy attitude. For one thing, it doesn't encourage effort. If everyone's getting paid the same, if everyone's equal, why try? To counter that, however, you could say that people can now pursue what they want, and at least everyone is equal. That's a lovely thing, if everyone to be equal. If it's actually, if we're able to do that, however, remains to be seen. However, the seizing of property, I think, the biggest issue is not only the pay, it's also the fact that you still need one person to rule. And this is where the problem occurs, because there have been many rulers, and communists and Marxists will argue this, and I think this is a fair point. They will say that's not true communism, and that's when you have things like Mao's China and Stalin's Russia. I could go on, but they're the two most biggest examples. And they don't end up too well. People and millions have starved and died. And I'm not having a go at the ideologies. This is fact. And like I said, people will argue whether this is true or thing, and that's your choice to make. But you still need someone to rule, and that kind of contradicts the whole point of a communist society, meant to be equal, but you need rulers. So whether it's actually possible, that remains to be seen. But but thank you for coming on to the show, and I hope the audience have enjoyed this.
Well, that's our show. But before we go, I want to send out a quick message.
So there we have it. That is Karl Marx and Communism. Now, if you stuck around to the end, well done. Thank you. I quite enjoyed this little book. If you want to pick up your own Communist Manifesto, you can get it for free, I think, on Amazon. I bought one at the store for it's $4.99. It was like an analytical one. It had a bit more information about it. I was trying to sum it up because I'm not so good when it comes to older texts. But you could pick up your own one if you want to have a read of it. I advise, if you're against communism, actually to maybe read it, just so you don't just go, oh, it's terrible. But no, I think it puts some good points. It has some flaws in it, like every philosophy. But I hope I've at least maybe explained it or dumbed it down, whatever you prefer. Or maybe thought it's a waste of time. But either way, maybe leave a comment, tell me what you think. And I'm also taking requests as well. So if you want me to search up a certain philosophy or look it up, start reading a book, let me know, and I might do that for our next video. Great. So any comment in any of my videos, I'm looking for. It'd be nice to have a bit of interaction with the audience. So thanks for sticking around, and see you soon.